Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming back to our special program on the National People's Congress. I'm Yang Rui. A new lineup of China's State Council, nominated by Premier Li Keqiang, was endorsed at the plenary meeting of the first session of the 13th National People's Congress. Yi Gang, as the new governor of the People's Bank of China, is going to take over the work from his predecessor, Mr. Zhou Xiaochuan, who has been serving in that position for 15 years. With a slowdown in China's economic growth and focus shifting to the quality of growth, China is going to deal with the challenges in a brand new era. As an American-trained economist who has been known for pushing pro-market overhauls, how will he carry out the prudent monetary policy? How will he manage the financial risks China is facing? And after more than 1 year since the renminbi was authorized to be included in the special drawing rights, how will he continue approaching the goal of renminbi internationalization? Today, we are happy to be joined by Professor Huo Deming from the National School of Development at Peking University. Sitting with us is also David Mahon, who is the Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment Management. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at this.
They are the highest-ranking positions within the Chinese government. Han Zheng, Sun Chunlan, Hu Chunhua, and Liu He have been endorsed as vice premiers. Wei Fenghe, Wang Yong, Wang Yi, Xiao Jie, and Zhao Kezhi were endorsed as state councillors. They took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. I
忠于中华人民共和国宪法，维护宪法权威，履行法定职责，忠于祖国，忠于人民，恪尽职守，廉洁奉公，接受人民监督，为建设富强、民主、文明、和谐、美丽的社会主义现代化强国努力奋斗。为建设富强、民主、文明、和谐、美丽的社会主义现代化强国努力奋斗。
Under the massive institutional restructuring plan, the State Council will consist of 26 ministries and commissions in addition to the General Office of the State Council. Yi Gang, an American-educated economist, is set to succeed Zhou Xiaochuan, the central bank's governor of more than 15 years. The choice of Mr. Yi, a protege and deputy of Mr. Zhou, almost guarantees continuity in Chinese financial policy.
Wang Yi
Other officials endorsed at the plenary meeting were Wang Yi, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wei Fenghe, Minister of National Defense. The endorsement of heads of several new ministries include Li Ganjie, Minister of Ecological Environment, Lu Hao, Minister of Natural Resources, Sun Xiaocheng, Minister of Veteran Affairs, and Wang Yupu, Minister of Emergency Management. The cabinet restructuring aims to deal with the institutional obstacles to help the market play a more decisive role in resource allocation. Lawmakers believe the biggest government reshuffle in years will help eliminate barriers in the function system and optimize its efficiency. CGTN, Beijing.
Gentlemen, we have had a mandate in the hands of the new generation of the Chinese leadership, either in terms of the Communist Party of China or the State Council. Look at the massive institutional reform. We have the new top banker, so many new faces of the vice premiers and ministers of so many departments and agencies. Now, what do you think of the mandate? What will be the most important task of greater urgency, David?
I think it's a matter now of something that's characterized Xi Jinping's last 5 years, which is a consolidation of leadership in China, particularly of the economy. And these new reforms are actually very positive. They're obscured in the Western media by other focuses such as term limits. But if you look at what has been announced in the last few days, you've got a refining and a level of efficiency now potentially in very key areas: economic reform, environmental leadership, anti-corruption. So this is a maturity of the party and government. And it really is also the recognition of how there has been greater and greater refinement and concentration over the last particularly 3 years. So I think that they're positive. And if one looks at it from a foreign investment point of view, we will expect to go on working in a more and more disciplined environment where courts function better and there is a greater security of investment. So from a business point of view, this is positive.
Professor Huang, with the Constitution Amendment, particularly the oath-taking ceremonies, do you think this is a very, very strong indication of having a new era?
Oh, definitely. We used to say open and reform. And I want to say open and reform in Chinese style, quote unquote. Now, what do we mean by that? You see, 20 or 30, even 20 years ago, the top leaders of China were talking about open and reform. Basically, what is they're saying that accepting what the status quo outside of China and hopefully bringing that into China and make some changes, reform, open. Now, well, 20 years passed, China has become completely different, at least from 20 years ago. China has its own economic powers. China could determine its own monetary policy as well as fiscal policies as well as a lot of other policies which could influence the rest of the world. So in a sense, it's not accepting the status quo, the outside world, and that is the agenda to reform China. Of course, within China, there's a lot of reform or opening need to be done, but in Chinese sort of special characteristics. And what does that mean? That only time will tell. So in a sense, I'm all anticipating the new era. And also, I'm very cautiously looking ahead because we are trying to reform and doing something unique, which is not has been taken from the rest of the world experiences. Some risks are involved, but hey, no risk and no return. And that is the status quo.
After the formation of the new government or state council, we are impressed by at least 3 new faces. One is, of course, Han Zheng, member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and he comes from Shanghai, where we had Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, right? And we also have Mr. Liu He, who rose from obscurity to prominence overnight almost. He is known for being the chief economic advisor to President Xi Jinping. Calling for the decisive role of the market forces in allocating and reallocating resources, and also Yi Gang, who has succeeded Zhou Xiaochuan as the top banker. Now, let's first of all look at the role that Liu He plays in re-examining the role of the market forces, David.
Well, the market forces have for some time defined most value in China. Although policy, fiscal policy, general economic policy, it seems to be trying to shape the economy overall, it's actually a government that has recognition that it needs to read the economic trends and needs to facilitate what is required. It's not as coercive as I think a lot of outside observers believe. For instance, the currency is looked upon as being highly manipulated for China's trade advantage, which just isn't true. And even devaluations last year were attempts to adjust the currency to find its true value. So I think the trend has been good in recent years and will continue, particularly with these individuals. You're maintaining or you're sustaining a lot of experience. You're bringing in people who are not, yes, when you look at the histories, there are some surprising rises. But if you look at what they have done, in particularly the last 5 years, these are very well experienced people and will keep a level of continuity. There are big challenges for China in its growing economy. And I think that China will need to look more carefully at opening some sectors globally for the domestic benefit. Service sector is one example. But if I look at banking policy, if I look at discipline within the banks in the last 12 to 18 months, it's very impressive. So I think we're in pretty good shape.
What do you think of the three top priorities for Premier Li Keqiang? And I believe Mr. Liu He must have done a lot in facilitating the implementation of the three tasks. One is, of course, no stimulus package. Second, deleveraging. And the third, new supply-side restructuring. Looking back, how do you evaluate the achievements of Premier Li Keqiang and under his leadership? We have to spare some time examining the role of Mr. Liu He.
Well, the three names, Liu He, Han Zheng, and Yi Gang, are the three. I think it's a very good combination. They're complementary to each other because they're all under Premier Li Keqiang's leadership, but still, Liu He has gained a lot of confidence from President Xi. Now, he would definitely be the mastermind of all the economics and financial reforms. But Liu He, as you mentioned, he is not a practitioner, nor he's from the academic side. So Yi Gang, on the other hand, is an American-trained economist. He's purely from the academic side. So in some sense, is an expert in monetary policy, but the monetary policy is not an independent tool in China. It needs to be coordinated with other sectors. Now, in this sense, Han Zheng is a practitioner. He's from Shanghai. He knows a lot from the daily experiences. So I believe for China, especially for the next 2 to 3 years, whenever you have sort of financial crisis, I'm not saying that financial crisis is coming, but when you have such a challenging environment, the trios, Liu He, Han Zheng, and Yi Gang, they would carefully manage China's road, the direction, at least the direction, so that such a big country will not, so to speak, too haste in liberalization of capital flows, or in some sense, people saying that Yi Gang is a financial reformist. He would like to see more flexible exchange rate regimes, but I don't think that would be the necessary case, because under the trios, a lot of anticipation, at least positive anticipation from me.
Thank you so much. You're watching Dialogue, or Voices and the Votes, our special program on the plenary session of the National People's Congress with David Mahon and Professor Huo Deming. On top of the agenda are how to prevent financial risks, monetary policy, and personnel change above all, because the overseas media follows very closely the massive personnel change of the leadership. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back, gentlemen. Ever since the 1998 financial crisis in Asia, presumably, we start to have a vicious cycle of a repeat every 10 years to have a financial meltdown. Now, 2018 is said to be a very dangerous year. What kind of financial environment has Mr. Zhou Xiaochuan left behind, the former central banker? And do you believe the way Mr. Yi Gang, his successor, handles the prudent monetary policy, the exchange regime, will help a lot a repeat of financial risks and financial crisis?
Well, I think if you look back over the last, say, 3 years, you see some major issues where, in a sense, the government was not strong enough to implement the kind of fiscal policies and economic disciplines that the country needed. The growth in debt, the waste of money in some of the municipalities that were using various means to heavily influence local banks and to make sure that they obeyed the local political and growth requirements, ignoring a lot of the things that the central government was trying to do. So there was overspending, there was a very steep growth in debt. This was seen by Western economists and banks as leading China into an immediate crisis. It wasn't. There was not a coming debt crisis, but there was a lopsidedness. There was too great a stimulus. Interestingly, we have a leadership change at the head of the bank, when this has already begun to change. This has begun to come down. The level of debt has certainly begun to decrease. And if you look even at the debt to GDP ratio, people would think China's in the top few in the world. It's number 50 of major economies. So, and most of it is owed to itself. So there was never a huge risk, but there was a risk of a lot of local distortion, a lot of waste of cash, a wearing down of reserves. We've come through this. So I think what is being passed on is a pretty solid position. But we cannot be in a position again where, for political weakness, there is an allowance for local municipalities, local leaders to squander a lot of money for cheap short-term growth. And I'm hearing out of this Congress and also the Party Congress a lot of messages where GDP growth is no longer such an objective. And I think we've got some pretty strong, experienced players now. I think Yi Gang is certainly one of them. Yes, he is an academic. He's a strategist. But he's a man who's been involved for the last 11 years in some of the most practical decisions that his bank has made. So I think the expectations of these people will be very high. I don't see any major issues globally. Of course, there can always be another tragic issue of derivatives in the global banking system. But domestically in China, I think we're in steadier shape than we were even 2 years ago. So nothing immediately. A loss of confidence in global markets is always an issue. But there again, China is not exposed.
Let me go back to the context in addressing the issue of RMB internationalization. Now, Mr. Yi Gang has allegedly been handpicked by his predecessor, Mr. Zhou Xiaochuan, for his expertise about monetary policies and forex issues. We have up to 3 trillion US dollars worth of forex reserves. Now, is that a blessing or a curse? The Americans are not very happy, at least. What do you think of the pace of internationalizing RMB? Because we have had this chronic issue of a cross-border flow of capital. And this is a catch-22 situation, isn't it? That on the one hand, you have listed RMB as one of the major reserve currencies in the special drawing rights of the International Monetary Fund. On the other hand, we've seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions outside China, and this is viewed increasingly as a potential that triggers the or catalyst for financial crisis inside China. So what do you think of any enormous efforts by either Zhou Xiaochuan or Yi Gang to balance the two things?
Well, let me give you a practical example. From year 2014 to 2016, PBOC did practice speeding up the capital flow. Now remember that there used to be the foreign reserve is like 4 trillion, close to 4 trillion. Now is 3 trillion. It used to be a year ago they got 2.8, 2.9 trillion. So in a sense that we have lost almost 1 trillion foreign reserves within that 3 years. So that gave PBOC a lot of experiences or a lot of
Don't forget, we have also slowed down the exports. Therefore, the accumulation of foreign capitals dropped significantly.
Everything is in a dynamic sense, that is, we're anticipating a lot of adjustments, with such a huge country, you cannot expect a completely closed up freezing of China with the rest of the world. So it has to be opened, but open in what ways? We're talking about capital flow, and that would be the most challenging tasks for PBOC as well as the rest of the government. Everybody is involved. Too fast, we're going to see a very fast depletion of the foreign reserves. From 3 trillion down to 2 trillion, it could be easily done in 1 year. And how about the exchange rate? Even if with the depletion of foreign reserves, would you accept the free float of renminbi? I don't think we would, and nobody would accept that.
Well, free flow of the money is one of the hallmarks of globalization, isn't it? Well, I wonder if you guys noticed what happened a few years ago when there were a lot of speculations as to the devaluation of RMB, having been accused by the Americans of manipulating the currency for years by lawmakers. China is very cautious about the exchange regime. Now, it is Yi Gang who came up with a strong belief there's no such a basis for continuous devaluation of RMB, since we're going to enjoy midterm and long-term, short-term and midterm prosperity. And also, we have such a big amount of forex reserve to cushion the impact of whatever financial meltdown that we saw 2 times. One first in 1998 in Asia, the second time in 2008 in Wall Street. So he was very confident that there's no such a strong possibility for devaluation of the RMB. Now, that has become a very famous punchline, often cited by experts in the circle of financial industry. What do you think of his confidence?
I think it's well placed. I think that the current level of the renminbi is about right. I don't see any real issues in the last 4 years. Before that, the renminbi was probably undervalued. I think there are. I mean, if you look at America's deficits, which is its big obsession, China was not a major contributor to the world economy when America basically accrued those deficits. There's very little case in economic history to say that a country like China, where the real engine is the domestic economy, it's its trade with itself, has an influence on the value of someone else's currency to the extent that Washington and the Fed is now accusing. It is scapegoating. When you have domestic problems to the extent and imbalances that America's been through, particularly since 2008, or you have the confusion as poor old Brussels is going through with the issues in Europe, exacerbated by Brexit, you've got to find someone outside your own malpractice, your own incompetency, to blame. And therefore, China has been blamed for a whole range of things which it has very little to do with.
It's part of the China bashing campaign, not only part of the presidential race, but it's generally someone who got to be singled out as a scapegoat in times of protectionism. What do you think of the alleged... No, Professor Hua, what do you think of the controlled floating rate?
Well, I love this topic of exchange rate. I remember last year, 2017, just around this time of the year, everybody expecting, well, by the end of 2017, 7.
Yeah.
I mean, 7 would be a very optimistic estimate. Some people will say 7.5, 8, and so on and so forth. I don't want to say the rest of numbers. But what happened? What happened? I still remember. I mean, that is a good example of when I want to predict the exchange rate in China. I'll be very cautious, but I also look at the process as a dynamic process, because everything changes from this week to next week. And
like what happened in South Africa. It's way too dramatic.
China is much bigger than South Africa. China is much bigger, but the exchange rate just shows what China could manage with their quote-unquote floating exchange rate. They can float upward. So with the appreciation of renminbi by mid last year, I would say, sometime I become clear, dawn and dumb.
Well, there's no big question about the current account, but what about the capital account for China? I mean, China is the biggest trading nation, and 4 decades into the globalization, we've taken so many measures to open up our market, and yet we refuse to fully open up the capital market, and we refuse to have a free convertibility of the RMB. Now, these 2 things effectively prevent our currency from being internationalized. However, when I consulted some of the real experts of financial studies, they say, Yang Rui, top priority at this moment for President Xi Jinping and the new generation of the leadership remains the prudent monetary policy and how to prevent financial risks. In this context, are you pessimistic somehow about the opening up of the capital account, and what's going to happen to RMB?
I'm not pessimistic. I think that, as Professor Hua has described, they have managed it well within this odd, rather interventionist, restrained basket.
Let me ask the question this way, gentlemen. Do you think our refusal to open up the capital account and denying free convertibility have contributed to the refusal and defiance of both the European Union and the United States to grant us the market economic status? I mean, years after we entered into the WTO.
That's a political tag. Unfortunately, market economic status.
Do you think this is a politician?
It's a political
this
tag.
Is politics?
It's politics more than economics, because one could argue, if you look at Europe and look at its tariffs and subsidies, look at the fortress that is Europe, if you're trading into Europe from outside and not a party to some special trade arrangement, if you look at the United States, if you look at the average tariffs, we may see some new ones on steel and aluminium. So it's a political tag, and I think China shouldn't worry what it's called anymore.
What about the anti-dumping, anti-subsidy investigations from both European Union and the United States?
Well, it depends how they're measured. If you take it into some measurements, which are, if you look at a simple equation that you are selling for more cheaply than you produce, then you are dumping. But if you look at a lot of the allegations made, not just with China, but between many countries, again, these are all part of the political to and fro in the competition. I think this is not the issue, and China should listen but not heed too much for criticisms of how it manages its capital account. There's another area, though, that's very important, and it's the gradual opening of services, because this will give an economy that is moving more to consumption and services. This is a more mature economy. It's going to have a slower growth rate because it can entertain a slower growth rate. It'll be exporting less because it doesn't need to. It'll become a much more deeply rooted economy, and in doing so, opening the door a little more to the service sector is probably going to be a very prudent move.
Let's take a closer look at the diversity of the external conditions. For example, the U.S. Congress is likely to roll out a package of punitive measures against China, since we have been regarded unanimously by the two parties as a strategic competitor. And President Trump has urged China to cut at least $100 billion worth of trade deficit, not quite in favor of the U.S.
Yes.
Do you think this will be a huge challenge for Liu He, Zhou Xiaochuan, the Yi Gang, a newly elected top banker?
If the target is 100 billion in terms of foreign trade, it's a huge amount.
Huge amount.
And that is going to be a challenge from the United States as well as in China.
God, that sounds like an ultimatum before they wage a trade war, gentlemen.
Well, ultimatum would be too drastic description, but I would say a lot of adjustment need to be done by both sides. Because I cannot imagine once, say, United States impose such a sanction or a tariff or whatever on China, then the direct suffering, it would be American people.
Very much so. If you think of American companies exporting back to America, and if you think of the other targets for this rather boastful and ludicrous move, you look at the entire European Union. They're not going to take this, they're going to fight very hard. So he's had some exceptions, Canada, perhaps Australia, but overall, the rest of the world is going to fight this. So in a sense, China will be in good collective company in resisting what is a rather absurd move.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your deep analysis about the Chinese economics. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.